state sovereignty. And I'll have to tell you, it has come from individuals who are on the left of the political spectrum. It's come from individuals on the right of the political spectrum and everything in between. It didn't come just when President Obama came into office. It had existed when President Bush was in office. This has been a consistent request that I've been getting from people. And in the first couple of years, I had decided not to pursue any such resolution, partly because I wasn't understanding of the issue, but also because I had so many other items on my agenda that I was trying to accomplish for people in my district, people in Nebraska. But for me, there was a proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and I may touch on that a little bit later on here in our talk. But ultimately, I decided I need to look at this. And in looking at this consistent request that I have received from numerous people, there was an underlying principle. And that principle has to do with the 10th Amendment and how Nebraska's independence, our sovereignty, how that plugs in to the broader scheme of our country. There's a concern out there on the part of people that the federal government has overstepped its bounds. And again, that concern is not just from one side of the political spectrum. It's come from all across. The underlying principle, I think, can be traced back to the 10th Amendment. So that's what prompted me really to move in this direction. And again, I'm hopeful that we can at least have some meaningful debate. A resolution, which is what I'm bringing forward, is not something that's binding with the force of statute. We're not passing a law, nor could we, I think, pass a law. But what we can do is to utilize our arena of ideas, our legislature, to have a discussion on the 10th Amendment, because I do think it's on a lot of people's minds.
Okay. I guess next I'd like to ask what type of support this resolution has garnered from the public so far.
I've heard from a lot of people, and I'll tell you, when I first made a decision, at least interiorly, to come forward and sponsor a resolution and research it and do the necessary work to put forward a reasonable resolution for us to talk about, for us to debate, I was a little intimidated because I recognize that it's possible that people could look at the resolution and determine that's too crazy, it's radical, it's not something that we ought to be discussing. But really that is the concern with any piece of legislation that one brings forward. There are going to be those in favor, there are going to be those against. Ultimately, my responsibility is to use my brain. I had a colleague here many years, Senator Chambers. He would say that over and over, use your brain, he'd say. And we really have that responsibility to think through an issue and determine whether this is worthy of the public's time to bring forward. And I made that determination. This is something that we ought to talk about. But it was intimidating for me personally. That intimidation has gone away because the support that I have received from the public has been immense. It's been enormous. Emails, phone calls, even phone calls to my home. My family and I were in the grocery store just last week, and a number of people that recognized me came up and said, "We're behind you on this resolution." So I was pretty intimidated. I was scared to bring it forward because it could be a controversial topic. But I'll tell you, the response from the public has been overwhelmingly in favor. At the bare minimum, could we at least talk about what's going on within the federal government, how it relates to our rights as citizens to govern ourselves, and under my purview, to govern ourselves via our state representatives.
Okay. Have you heard any sentiments so far that somehow this implies secession from the Union?
Yeah.
Or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a colleague of mine here in the legislature. We went on a national television program. When you talk about being intimidated, that was pretty intimidating. I was nervous, but we agreed to go on that program, and that was the first question I got asked: "Are you trying to secede from the Union?" And my response is no. And I'll take that even a step further. That's an unintelligent position. If I bring a resolution forward to talk about the 10th Amendment, okay? And someone construes that as trying to take Nebraska out of the United States. I don't know how to respond other than to say that's crazy, that is an unintelligent position. I want to talk about the 10th Amendment. I want to talk about the interplay between decisions made in Washington and how it affects our budget in Nebraska. Or for instance, how is it that a family-owned business, an independent small business in Nebraska, can get shut down by a decision made by somebody else, somebody who's not the business owner? How does that happen? These are legitimate talking points. These are legitimate points of debate. And no, we're not trying to secede from the Union. If we were, then I'd say that. This is simply a resolution. It doesn't have the binding authority of law. We're trying to talk about the 10th Amendment. And if there are those who construe the 10th Amendment to be something other than it is, I just ask them to read it. Take a look at it. Those powers that are enumerated within the Constitution, specifically to the federal government, those exist, but those powers not enumerated and not prohibited by the Constitution to the states, they fall to the states. Pretty straightforward. It ought to be something that we, the public, we Nebraskans ought to be able to grasp, at least in some principle. Let's have a talk about what that means. And if the resolution comes out and the only thing that we can agree on is that the 10th Amendment exists and that we Nebraskans have some consternation, some problems, some concerns with how the 10th Amendment is being regarded in Washington, if that's all that comes out of this debate, I think that's more than what we have today. I think that'd be a plus.
Yes, it seems the federal government, the three branches of the federal government, frequently have, back and forth dialogue, about separation of powers and balance of power. That goes on all the time in Washington. They'll discuss things like that. It seems personally reasonable, or perfectly reasonable, that, the state and federal should also be able to have that dialogue.
Right.
And this is just saying we want to have a dialogue
Right.
about our rights.
Part of the dialogue, there will be debate, there will be new ideas generated within the thoughts, within the minds of Nebraskans, as well as those of us here in the legislature. That's what dialogue does. I'm seeing things from a certain vantage. Another person may see it from a different vantage. Someone with a different life experience may look at the 10th Amendment in a way that I hadn't previously considered. And likewise, that's what's good about Nebraska. We can have these debates and these discussions. This is a debate, a discussion which has been going on pretty much since the beginning of our union, and it should. I think in the beginning, framers had an idea that there ought to be some tension between the federal government and the states, and that tension exists such that we can have a meaningful dialogue on how we're moving forward. But it just seems in recent years that it is as if federal government has completely forgotten about the 10th Amendment. We're talking about things which I think, if read in the context of the 10th Amendment, wouldn't be talked about. The government taking over GM, or the potentiality of a nationalized healthcare system. That's not something that's enumerated in the Constitution. So how we move forward is very important, because it's going to affect the states. The states are the ones who have the lion's share of rights, because most rights aren't, or powers, I shouldn't say rights, powers. There are only a scant few powers enumerated by the Constitution given to the federal government. Those not enumerated and not prohibited to the states fall to the states. So we ought to be able to have this discussion. It's a discussion that's been going on since the beginning of our republic, and we ought to continue the discussion. It's part of our I think it's part of my responsibility as a representative of people in the legislature, people in Nebraska at the legislature. We ought to be able to have this discussion.